Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Duran. I'll be your host for today. I want to welcome you all to this, the first of our webinars in the year of 2022. It is number 81 of this series of webinars. And welcoming you into the new year with some fear and trepidation, as is reflected in this cartoon, which I think expresses where we are at today, approaching the new year with uncertainty as to what it holds. But of course, what we're going to be looking at today is not only the future, but also the past year and our assessment of what it held for us and where that might lead us in the coming year and years. For those who are not familiar with the Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. You know, due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events that generated revenue for us, and our educational trips. And so we now depend upon you for donations. Please donate at www.globaljusticecenter.org. Any donation of any size will be appreciated. That will enable us to continue to pay our Mexican staff and support these webinars. Today's program is a retrospective on the past year. Our panel will include two economists, an activist philosopher, and historian. You know, the pandemic just won't let up. Growing climate collapse, continuing racism, worsening U.S. relations with both Russia and China, deep economic problems, massive refugee migrations, widening inequalities, both within and between societies, and a dysfunctional political system that is unable to deal with any of this. Well, all of that has contributed to a mood of despair and sets the stage for the discussion from our panelists today. We will start off with Doug Henwood, who is an economic analyst and journalist who's long edited the Left Business Observer. He's also a contributing editor at The Nation. Second will be Jeff Faux, also an economist and well known to our audiences, especially here in San Miguel, since he used to be an annual visitor to San Miguel and gave a lecture that always packed the house. Sorry we don't have him with us this January, but hopefully before too much longer, it will be possible for him to return to San Miguel. Our third speaker will be Peter Kuznick, who is a well-known historian focusing on international relations. He's well known for his collaboration with Oliver Stone on the untold history of the United States. He has a busy day today because immediately following this webinar, he's going to be interviewed by Russian TV about the US-Russian talks going on today. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Cynthia Kaufman, a philosopher and an activist. She will be looking more to the future, and she's the author of Challenging Power, and that's probably what it takes to sustain a sense of hope for the future, which is what she will be talking about. Well, that's the order in which we'll ask them to present. And following their presentations, I'll invite them to react to each other in some discussion, and then open the floor to our audience. So let me give the floor first then to Doug Henwood.
Well, thank you, Cliff, and thanks for having me here, and hello to everyone else as well. And I want to apologize for talking mostly about the United States. That may be provincial of me, but it's also what I know best, and I feel shy about talking about things I don't know very well. Way back in the early COVID era, I wrote and said a lot about how the crisis blatantly exposed the many fissures in American society. It was of class, race, geography, politics, and so much more, and how the only way to address the crisis seriously was with an ambitious redistributive and public investment agenda. Along their way, there have been some pleasant surprises, but also a lot of predictable disappointments. The surprise has been the generosity of fiscal support. The CARES Act, passed under Trump, wasted a lot of money on ill-designed business support programs that gave plenty of cash to firms that didn't need it and made it really hard on those that did. It was administered opaquely through banks and distributed in ways that made no geographic or sectoral sense. Industries that should have been downsized for ecological reasons, like airlines and fossil fuels, got generous support. But still, the aid to households was massive and life-saving, so large that despite a collapse in wage and salary incomes between the first and second quarters of 2020, personal income rose because of a 75% increase in transfer payments. And then we got another couple of rounds of it, notably the giant package of the early Biden administration. All those payments are ebbing now. Expanded unemployment insurance benefits ended last fall, and earlier in some Republican states, the stimmy checks are a fading memory, and the last of the child credit payments were just sent out. Still, transfer payments overall in the third quarter of 2021 were more than a quarter higher than they were in the last pre-pandemic quarter. But as those supports ebb, strains are starting to show. According to the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey, an examination of the material and social well-being of American households the Bureau began in May 2020. The number of respondents reporting having no difficulties in paying the regular bills fell by 15 million between May and December of last year. From the onset of the pandemic through last summer, households relied surprisingly little on credit cards or asset sales, which includes liquidating their savings, to make ends meet. That started changing last August, and now the share of borrowing in the funding of expenditures is rising. Over the same period, help from unemployment insurance and stimulus payments evaporated. The redistributive measures were huge but temporary, and there seems to be little prospect for renewing them, much less making generous income supports permanent. One hoped that a health crisis would have provoked serious reform of our healthcare system, but it's still a mess. Not only around the provision of insurance, which is sorely lacking, but also around broad public health policy. On the one hand, we have very rich hospitals like Mass General, which behave like elite private corporations, and broke hospitals in poor urban neighborhoods and rural areas struggling to care for very sick populations. While vaccine distribution has worked pretty well by US standards, we've been unable to produce COVID tests and distribute them in adequate quantities. The poor underlying health of so much of our people has rendered scores of millions far more vulnerable than they should be to COVID, not to mention an array of other diseases. But then there's been monetary policy, which has been hyper generous, although the Federal Reserve is now saying very clearly that it's on the verge of reversing that. Not only did the central bank drive interest rates down towards zero, but it also pumped almost $5 trillion into the financial markets, mainly by buying treasury bonds, but also mortgage-backed and corporate bonds. Through those purchases, the Fed essentially financed over half the government deficit during the COVID era. In the early days of this crisis, that largesse made good sense. Markets briefly froze in panic, and the Fed did what central banks are supposed to do, which is shower plenty of reassurance backed by a large flow of money created out of thin air. But the largesse has continued well past the point of that crisis. While all that money creation did little to stimulate the real economy, it did send the financial markets on a tear. Stocks are up almost 80% from their March 2020 panic low, but it's not just stocks. In fact, I can't think of any bubble in modern history that has seen so many assets soar in value. Housing up 27% and almost 50% above the peak of the early 2000s bubble. Bitcoin and other ludicrous cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin's price rose by almost 1,300% from March 2020 through November 2021, although it's taken some of a hit as the Fed turned more hawkish. There's been lunacy like NFTs and huge wads of cash going from venture capitalists into unicorns and decacorns, private companies valued at $1 billion and $10 billion respectively, many of which make no profit and have very poor prospects for ever doing so. It's one of the great bubbles of all time, and one can only imagine how it will all end. Not well is all I can say with confidence. And then there's the inflation problem, which is something that mainstream liberals have a hard time dealing with, but is causing Democrats and Biden major political headaches. For months, they said it wasn't real, and when it persisted, they scrambled for other explanations, like corporate concentration and greed. But greed is a constant under capitalism, and concentration hasn't changed much from a couple of years ago when inflation was 2%, not 6 or 7 like it is now. My interpretation is that the fiscal and monetary stimulus that injected trillions of purchasing power into an economy stretched thin by decades of underinvestment by corporations who much preferred stock buybacks to capital investment, and governments who are incapable of taxing to fund infrastructure spending, all that stimulus just overheated a rather stretched and feeble in many ways economy. Just-in-time inventories and global supply chains were great for short-term profits, but they've crumbled under heavy demand and corona-driven worker shortages. When Biden came into office, the early signs gave me some hope that some of I talked about that ambitious agenda I talked about at the beginning, that the COVID crisis seemed almost practical. I had some hope that would actually be enacted. The early passage of the support package was encouraging. Then it all began falling apart. We can blame the Manchinima pair for some of it, but it's not just a matter of a couple of Senate troublemakers. While Biden's margin of popular victory was large, the Dems' congressional majorities are very thin. This is not like FDR in 1933 with a mandate to remake things, not a revolutionary transformation, of course, but a substantial transformation of US capitalism. But FDR also had a favorable terrain to work with at the elite level. His administration was full of renegade wasps, of which he was the chief representative, and the forces of conservatism have been decimated by the crash and depression. In other words, there was a substantial block of the ruling class that was amenable to serious reform, or at least incapable of blocking it. That's not true now. We have a ruling class that is deeply divided between an outright reactionary contingent based heavily in dirty industries, privately held corporations, and private equity, for which the Koch network serves as accurate shorthand. They find political expression in a Republican Party that is probably the most reactionary mainstream party in the Northern Hemisphere. Nowhere is this clearer than with the climate crisis. It's impossible to imagine the GOP pledging carbon neutrality by 2045, as have the German Christian Democrats, who are also committed to ramping up renewables. The British Tories have a green wing encouraged by Prime Minister Boris Johnson's wife, although Bojo himself is committed to carbon neutrality by 2050, and his government has banned fracking. How serious these parties are over the long term is open to question, but at least they talk like they care. Compare this with the Texas Republican Party platform. We support the defunding of climate justice initiatives, the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency, and repeal of the Endangered Species Act. Inspiring. Or with Ted Cruz's Energy, Water, Environment webpage, which doesn't mention the word climate, but does promote fracking in building the Keystone Pipeline. Against that, there's a centrist wing of the ruling class organized around senior executives of some Fortune 500 corporations and parts of Wall Street, like brand name investment banks and money managers like BlackRock, along with the liberal types in Hollywood, the media, and tech. We can think of them as the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. They're open to a modest reform agenda as long as you don't raise their taxes or step on their profits. Neither wing of this ruling class can be considered hegemonic, but the right wing is much more energized and coherent. This division is behind the Washington stalemate. The mainstream Dems are basically running as the not Trumps with little positive in offer, and the Republicans are just raving mad. There's signs of energy on the US left and have been since the Sanders campaign of 2016. While both his campaigns failed, he did spark a revival of socialism, at least in word, of a sort we haven't seen in this country for decades. And I was shocked to learn the other day that Thomas Piketty has now come out as a socialist, as has Robert Kuttner. Strange events in these, at least in some parts of the political spectrum. While that left tendency has some presence in Congress, it certainly can't pass legislation. It has logged some successes at the local levels on city council and in state legislatures. I never could have imagined that there would be a socialist caucus in the New York State legislature, historically a low, mean body, but there is one. The New York City Council is the most progressive in decades, although we just elected a former cop with a strange petty bourgeois politics as mayor. The executive branch is always a problem. I wish I could conclude on a note of stirring optimism. Maybe I'll try for a mildly hopeful one. The mobilization on the left, and you could draw a line from Occupy Wall Street a decade ago through the first Sanders campaign half a decade ago, through the growth of Democratic Socialists of America, an organization I'm an active member of, and the proliferation of young climate activists. This is the most inspiring thing that's happened in our politics since the 1960s. But politics in the mainstream remain at a stalemate between manic reaction and a torpid center, a stalemate reinforced by our antique constitution and structure of governance. I feel like we're going to stumble deeper into climate disaster, much like we stumbled through COVID, with a political class unable to do much of anything and a populace that's detached and unable to provoke any serious departure from the status quo. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm open to persuasion to the contrary. Thanks.
Okay, me? Well, I don't have, I have no quarrel with what Doug just said. I think it was an excellent summary of what's happened. Wait a minute. Okay. There's plenty of room for despair. I'm glad we're not asked to forecast, because my own confidence in my ability to prognosticate has really dropped over the last 5 or 6 years. My own guess is that the conventional wisdom about 2022 is probably right in several areas. Inflation will subside. Biden's spending plans will be cut even more, and he'll get a small part of the package that he wants. My guess is that the Republicans will take either the House or the Senate. It's interesting, there are only 4 Senate seats that are really up for grab, and about 14 House seats. So anything's possible. That's as far as what I could think about in terms of the future. I want to talk about 2 things that I think I learned over the last few years, especially since the last election. One is about the crisis of the liberal left. The other is about war and the dangers. The good news, I think, on the left is that its ideas have greater public support than at any time in my memory, and my memory goes back quite a bit, on gender and race equality, on universal health care, minimum wage, labor unions, tax the rich, global warming, gun control. All of these things that are part of the left's agenda have more support than they ever had. To pick up on what Doug said about FDR, there have been really 2 times in the last 100 years where the United States has seen a real progressive surge that stuck. One, of course, was the New Deal with FDR, and the other was the Great Society with Lyndon Johnson. It's interesting that neither of these two came from the left. FDR was a corporate lawyer. Lyndon Johnson was a Southern senator with a lot of reactionary friends. But they both were smart enough to see that something had changed, and they took advantage of it. Like them, Biden is a centrist. I had some dealings with Biden when he was a senator, and I can tell you he was certainly not a progressive and not generally very impressive. But he got something last year or during the campaign. And it hit me one day while I was listening to a tape, excuse me, of a speech he gave in Pennsylvania. He said, Milton Friedman is not running the show anymore. Well, this was a little different Joe Biden than I'd been used to talking to in past years. And so he got into office. He stopped the Keystone Pipeline, increased social welfare. He put elements of the Green New Deal in his big budget plan. Wants to raise the corporate tax, not as far as it was before Trump dealt with it, but still he wants to raise it. And the Secretary of Treasury is going around the world talking about a global minimum corporate tax. So that's all part of the good news. The bad news is that the left does not have the political strength to match its ideological gains. The brutal truth is that the reactionary right has out-organized, outsmarted, and been more creative than the left has. I'm not talking about the neoliberal center is collapsing. Not collapsed, but it's collapsing. And the right rushed in, took over the Republican Party, sold a corrupt billionaire to the working class, while the left couldn't even nominate its candidate for president in the Democratic Party, and it couldn't deliver a majority in Congress for its agenda. Now, I'm not talking it's somebody's fault and all of that stuff. I just want to express what I think is the reality. And the right stole left ideas. That's the ironic part of all this. Trump stole the left's ideas on trade. And that gave him, in 2016, the Midwest and the working class in the Midwest who felt betrayed by the Democratic Party over trade. Trump stole lines about the distrust of the establishment from the left. And it's going on now. If you drill into the conspiracy theory of the anti-vaxxers, what many will tell you is that it's a conspiracy between big pharma and the government. Well, the left has been talking about that for the last 20, 30 years. And now it's a staple of the right conspiracy theory. Today, Marco Rubio and people like Hallie are talking about industrial policy, where you could be laughed out of the room at Democratic Party circles for the last few decades. And a majority of Republicans in a recent common poll, Pew or Gallup, a majority of Republicans, 53% favor a wealth tax. Now, the Republicans are not going to deliver it, we know that. But there's something going on where the left has made gains ideologically and policy ideas, and it's the right that has picked their pockets in a way. What that says to me is I think we've got to do some painful rethinking about our assumptions. One is that by mobilizing around non-white identity, we can take power in this country. There's just not enough people in that category. There's a factoid going around about by 2040, non-whites will be in the majority in the United States. And that comes from a census forecast, which includes all Hispanics. as non-white. But then when you look at the census data on the question of what do you think your race is, 60 to 70% of Hispanics say they're white. Do that and the arithmetic comes out like something like 2060, 70% of the country is going to be still white. So we got to think about our political mobilization ideas around that. 2016 to 20, to 1920, the two elections, there was a net shift of African-American votes and Latino votes towards Trump. Small, especially the African-Americans, but significant, very significant in some Southwest states like Texas along the border. This is the number that really, I don't know what to deal with, but the LGBT community went from 14% Trump to 28% in the election of 2020. Now, this business of identity politics is complex. There's controversy between class versus identity as the basis of organizing. But I can tell you at the end of this recent experience, I come away with the old adage that the whole point of war and politics is to unite your allies and divide your enemies. Today, the right is openly organizing at the state and local government to steal the next election. I mean, it's transparent and it's admitted. That's what they're going to do. The left is not powerful enough to stop it by itself. The left cannot stop fascism, which I think is growing in this country, by itself. January 6th was stopped by cops and the National Guard. I get these emails, every day I get an email talking to me about the dangers of civil war to come. I don't think we're going to have any civil war. But if we do, we want the cops and the National Guard on our side because the other side's got guns and they know how to shoot better than we do. I spent most of my professional life, as Cliff knows, denouncing Democratic centrists. But today, as tasteful as it is, I think we have to recognize that if the center goes down, that is if Biden and all those people that we have some suspicions of go down, the left will go down with them. All right, I'd just like to make another couple of comments about the second issue, which is war. Saying that about Biden is one thing on domestic issues, but they are clearly beating the drums of war, in my view. And it's not coming from the right again. This one is coming from the center. Read through the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NPR, and the demonization of our enemies of Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela. I mean, this just keeps going on and on and on. And pushing Biden's absurd alliance of humanitarian Democrats against the authoritarian. Among the humanitarian Democrats invited to that White House meeting a month or so ago was Pakistan. In Pakistan, they give the death penalty for criticizing the Quran, the death penalty. Here again, in a way, Trump picked the pockets of the left, not the Democrats, but the left. He took the critique of our massive military involvement around the world, and he took that and he talked about that. Trump would get on and say, well, what are we doing in all these places? That's a good question, even if it comes from this preposterous idiot. Trump is, of course, not serious. He's a cynical huckster. But many on the left leaders, can't go there. It sounds nationalistic. It sounds isolationist. We're citizens of the world. But when Trump asked, what are we doing in NATO? That was not a bad question. Here we are in NATO, risking war, pushing the Russians to save a Ukrainian kleptocracy. So Biden gets a pass, basically, for a new Cold War. Russia, China, et cetera. The ubiquitous enemy, terror, which requires us to have 800 bases in 80 countries. By one estimate, American military op-eds, not special ops, sorry, are in 140 countries. At any rate, those are a couple of things I've learned that one is about our political mobilizing and the other is the threat of war. My view is that, I mean, even without war, we cannot afford anymore, if we ever could, but we can't now, an empire abroad and prosperity at home. That is not possible. Even if we get a Green New Deal, we can't do it if we're out there trying to organize the world for the American empire. More Cold War, forget the Green New Deal. Maybe part of the current story is that Democrats think they have to, or they owe the Pentagon for not having gone over to Trump, when there was a time there, in early January, where there was a real question about what the Army was going to do, which is what happens when you have this kind of a polity going on. So maybe the Democrats think they owe the Pentagon because they didn't go for the fascist, or part of the story may be subconsciously or consciously that the only way to get unity in this country is through fear of a foreign enemy. That's an old story, and my worry is that it will come back. Thanks. That's it. Maybe Peter has some. I'm interested in Peter's comments about this.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. That is a good lead-in for Peter Kuznick, who will be our next speaker.
Well, those were two terrific presentations, and there's not much that I would take issue with that either Doug or Jeff said. Let me first apologize by saying I've been so busy that I threw together some comments this morning, and I've written some of them out, and I've got them up on the screen, so I'm going to be trying to read some of them. I have no idea how long this would take, so maybe somebody keep an eye on the clock for me. But I was recently asked by an interviewer, which year in US history did 2021 most resemble? And because the focus of this interview is mostly on the threat to American democracy, she was probably expecting me to say 1859 or 1860, but I said 2020, because disturbingly little has changed from the last year of the Trump presidency to the first year of the Biden presidency. Not that Biden is like Trump. Biden is totally different than Trump. I agree that Trump was a disaster in almost every way imaginable, an embarrassment, not only to his family, not only to his party, not only to his nation, but to the human species. I mean, Trump was an entity unto himself, and Biden is a very decent human being who I think wants to do the right thing. And if his Build Back Better program gets implemented, this will be a kinder and fairer country. But if we look at what has actually changed from the last year of the Trump presidency to the first year of the Biden presidency, besides the optics and Trump's being constantly in our face and spreading his poison, the answer is disturbingly little. The country and the world are in just as precarious a position now as we were in 2020, and maybe even more so. This is not just because Trump still controls the Republican Party and the party's goal is to thwart Biden's agenda. It's not just because of Manchin and Sinema. It's not just because of QAnon and the anti-vaxxers and the fact that we haven't distributed vaccine around the rest of the world. It's that Biden has doubled down on Trump's policies in area after area, especially when it comes to US role in the world. Biden has not only doubled down on many of Trump's policies, he's legitimized them much in the same way that Obama legitimized so many of Bush's policies. I vividly recall the words of Ari Fleischer, Bush's annoying press secretary, who pointed out in a June 2013 interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper, he said, quote, across the board, when you look at what Obama's done, he's continued so many of the Bush administration policies, from drone strikes to military commissions to wiretaps to renditions to you name it, he's doing it. It's like George Bush is having his fourth term. The same point is made by Bush Justice Department official Jack Goldsmith, who realized that Cheney's rebuke of Obama for reversing Bush-era terrorism policies was flat out wrong. Goldsmith wrote in the New Republic, quote, the truth is closer to the opposite. The new administration has copied most of the Bush program, has expanded some of it, and has narrowed only a bit. Almost all of the Obama changes have been at the level of packaging, argumentation, symbol, and rhetoric. The Obama strategy, he says, can thus be seen as an attempt to make the core Bush approach to terrorism politically and legally more palatable and thus sustainable. I'm afraid that Biden is doing the same thing when it comes to foreign policy. Now, one can argue that foreign policy is almost always bipartisan, that both parties feed at the trough of the military-industrial complex, that both vote for constantly bigger defense budgets, that both have their hands out to corporate lobbyists, that both support America's empire of bases and endless wars. But the Democrats make it look like we're doing it in the name of freedom and democracy. They put a smiling face on American empire in ways that Republicans can't, which is not to suggest that there's not a difference between the two parties. The difference right now is vast on one level. While racism has always been a driving force in American history, as not only slavery, but 5 million Klan members in the 1920s attest, it was only recently that it's been weaponized and embraced so openly by one of the two major political parties, whose platform consists little more than white supremacy, misogyny, neoliberalism, militarism, and wealth transference from the working and middle classes to the richest Americans. I think Gore Vidal nailed it when he said to a British interviewer who asked why Obama doesn't respond more forcefully to vicious Republican attacks upon him. And Gore Vidal said, Obama believes the Republican Party is a political party, when in fact it's a mindset like Hitler Youth, based on hatred, religious hatred, racial hatred. When you foreigners hear the word conservative, you think of kindly old men hunting foxes. They're not. They're fascists. And not only are they Republicans fascists, but they're fascists who control a vast media network through Fox News, talk radio, and other outlets. And so they spread their lies about the elections. They spread their misinformation. The fact that 71% of Republicans believe that Biden is not a legitimate president, that's down only from 73% a year ago, is shocking. That 45% of Trump voters also believe that the insurrectionists on January 6th were Antifa activists and other leftists who are masquerading as Trump supporters. So as Voltaire once said, which has been paraphrased as, if you can get people to believe absurdities, you can get them to commit atrocities. So that's where we're at now in 2022. But when I look at the 2021, as we were asked to do, some things jump out at me. The first is on the nuclear front. The bullet and the atomic scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 2 minutes before midnight in 2018, after we almost went to war with North Korea. That's the closest to midnight we've been since the clock was started back in 1947. But in 2020, they moved the hands to 100 seconds before midnight. I think it's time to move the hands closer now. US relations with Russia and China are the worst they've been in decades, probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. I started this fall by doing dozens and dozens of interviews about the Xi Biden summit meeting and the threat of war over Taiwan. By mid-November, the focus has shifted to the threat of war over Ukraine. In between, I did interviews about the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that stalled, also about the Democracy Summit, global warming, and some other things. But the two that concern me the most, global warming and the nuclear, because they're the existential crises we face. We know that it was great that Biden got us back to the Paris Climate Accords. But the experts say that if we follow through on the Paris Climate Accords, they say that if we increase the global temperature more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above what it was at the start of the industrial era, then we're in deep trouble. Well, if we follow through on the Paris Climate Accords, we're going to be 2.7 degrees Celsius above, 1.2 degrees above the 1.5 that we warn is a point beyond which we're in very serious trouble. So that's number one. But the second, of course, is the nuclear crisis. Most of my students are very alert about, and the younger generation in general is very sensitive to the threats posed by climate change. They are totally oblivious to the much more immediate threat posed by nuclear war. And so when I think about this as a historian, I mean, I could go back to 1948. I can go back to Kennan's memo in 1948, when he says we've got 6.3% of the world's population, and we control 50% of the world's goods and world's wealth. He said the question before us, the challenge, is to maintain this position of disparity. But when I look at the new Biden administration, and I see where these advisors come from, there are 16 members of the Center for New American Security in top positions in the Biden administration. That includes Kurt Campbell, the brains behind the Asia pivot, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. Fortunately, Michelle Flournoy didn't get in there, but the rest of them have. And these people are very reminiscent in some ways of the neocons who were in the Project for a New American Century, who flooded into the George W. Bush administration. There's so much to be said about that, but let me jump to when the current CIA director, William Burns, was the US ambassador to Russia in 2008, when George Bush and NATO started to talk about NATO expansion to Ukraine and Georgia. Burns wrote back a confidential memo to Washington titled "Niet means Niet." Don't cross Russia's red lines when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia, when it comes to NATO expansion. And we backed off of that for a while. But the reality is that whether the promise was given in writing in 1990 that NATO would not expand to the east, or it was only said verbally, the Russians, Gorbachev, believed this. But NATO, as we know, has now expanded 14 countries to the east, right to Russia's doorstep. And so the conflict now over Ukraine is a conflict about, I guess one of the key issues to understand is, why is this happening now? When the US has been ignoring Russia's national security interests for 3 decades now. But the difference now is that Russia is in a much stronger position for a couple reasons. Number one, Europe is heavily dependent on Russian natural gas for its energy supplies this summer. So even though natural gas supplies costs have quadrupled, and with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline coming online, the Europeans are loath to break with Russia at this moment. Number two, Russia is feeling much stronger militarily than it had for years. After the US abrogated the ABM Treaty in 2002, Russia began its buildup. And it takes a long time to modernize one's nuclear arsenal, as the US is finding out. It was March 1st, 2018, that Putin gave his State of the Nation address, in which he said Russia now has developed 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent US missile defense. They've begun to deploy these. And we're not just talking about hypersonics. So that's very, very important for us to understand, that Russia feels in a much more confident position militarily. And Russia has also about 70% completed modernizing its armed forces, aside from its nuclear arsenal. So even though all 9 nuclear powers are currently modernizing their nuclear arsenals, the US modernization program is going to go on for another 25 years. And so that puts Russia in a position of strength, that they think they can stand up in ways that they didn't before. The same thing now with China. You probably remember when in March of 2021, the Chinese foreign minister and state counselor Wang Yi and the director of Central Foreign Affairs Commission of the CCP, Yang Jiechi, met in Anchorage with Sullivan and Biden. And Biden went through the list for 2.5 minutes of all the things that the US was complaining about China about. But Yang responded uncharacteristically, and he says, so let me say here that in front of the Chinese side, the US does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength. The US side was not even qualified to say such things, even 20 or 30 years back, because this is not the way to deal with the Chinese people. If the US wants to deal properly with the Chinese side, then let's follow the necessary protocols and do the right thing, right way. And he went through the list of US transgressions, of the US invasions all over the world, of the things that the United States has done. And he said that you can't speak to us in this way any longer. And so, but we look at the bigger picture. It was in November of 2011 that Hillary Clinton wrote her article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century, in which she talks about the Asia pivot. Well, we've been talking about that and trying to shift. So Biden does finally pull US forces out of Afghanistan, but it happened in a totally chaotic and bungled way that made him look very weak. And part of the problem we face now, part of the constraints upon Biden, is that in the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal, which was the right thing to do, that both parties have been attacking him, at least the hawks of the Democratic Party, the Menendezes and the Maryland senator, have been attacking him for being so weak. And at the same time, the Republicans have. You might remember that after Biden's after his latest phone conversation with Putin, he immediately got attacked by Ronna McDaniel. She didn't even wait till the meeting was over before she started attacking him, the chair of the Republican National Committee, for being weak, for his America Last strategy, for his ineptitude, and for what he's doing to undermine the United States. They couldn't wait to start attacking him. So because of that, Biden is in a position where he's got to stand tough against and look tough against the Russians and the Chinese. So when Biden says something stupid like, I don't respect Russia's red lines, he better start respecting Russia's red lines. Because as William Burns says, niet means niet, start respecting these red lines. So Russia is in some ways serious now. They're feeling empowered. The same thing with China right now. And so the US is acting, basically saying that we're not going to abide by certain aspects of our one China policy that's been US policy for decades. And the US has been strengthening Taiwan. We've now found out that there have been US military trainers in Taiwan. The US has been not only sending increased number of arms to Taiwan, but giving them this increased training. The US also recently concluded the AUKUS deal between the US and the UK and Australia. A very, very provocative, further militarizing the confrontation in that region. China has been responding similarly. China has been inflexible, having a very hard line as well. And so China responded by sending 150 warplanes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone recently. But we have to remember that if there is a military confrontation, either over Ukraine or over Taiwan, the Chinese will prevail in Taiwan and the Russians will prevail in Ukraine. The Pentagon has conducted 18 war games over a war between the US and China over Taiwan, and China has won all 18. So what scares me, among other things, and we see the situation in Ukraine, where the US has also been escalating, putting more arms, lethal arms, which Obama did not do, into Ukraine, sending more anti-tank missiles, giving more NATO training. At least a dozen NATO countries are in their training. At the same time that Ukraine is buying Turkish Bayraktar armed drones that were used by Azerbaijan so successfully. So as the Washington Post wrote in November, one day, quote, in 2020, US destroyers entered the Barents Sea, where Russia's Northern Fleet is located, for the first time since the Cold War, unaccompanied by Russian vessels. US supersonic B-1 Lancers trained the Ukrainian jets near Russia for the first time also in 2020. And in another first, US nuclear-capable B-52s flew through the Ukrainian airspace, looping near Crimea alongside Ukrainian fighter jets. In addition, the British sent warships right near Crimea. There have been confrontation after confrontation, and these confrontations are growing. And so I guess I'm probably running out of time. But you see the insanity of some of the things that are being said. When I hear members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, like Roger Wicker from Mississippi, calling for raining destruction on Russia, and says, I refuse to rule out first-use nuclear action if Russia invades Ukraine, I take such lunacy seriously, as I do recent statements from Admiral Charles Richard, the head of the US Strategic Command, who said last year, there is a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons. And so that's where we are now. So if there is a military confrontation in either situation, does a weakened Biden cry uncle and give in to the reality, or does the US escalate in other ways, whether it's sending more NATO troops to surround Russia, giving more aid, and recognizing Taiwan's independence and leading to a military confrontation there? We're in a very precarious situation now globally that has me very, very worried. And I'm glad there's negotiation. I'm glad that Wendy Sherman, who's relatively reasonable negotiator and diplomat, is meeting with Ryabkov today, and that there's been more meetings going on later this week. That's a good sign. I'm glad that Biden did not do what Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, did when Russia issued its demands. He dismissed them out of hand. Biden did not do that. So the fact that we're talking rather than threatening in certain ways, the fact that it's diplomacy right now is a good sign. That makes me somewhat hopeful. But the overall dynamic right now, the overall trajectory is very, very worrisome, and I think more dangerous than any time since at least the Cuban Missile Crisis, if not the early Cold War. Anyway, so I'll be happy to go into more of this later. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. Very troubling, to say the least. And we will now pass the mic to Cynthia Kaufman, who will maybe give us a little more hope for the future. But let's see. The floor is yours, Cynthia.
That always is my job. I hate to say it, but that's the job I always take, is the let's look on the bright side, not because I'm an optimist, but because I'm a Gramscian. And so I think what I want to say is that I really agree with everything that everybody has said, right? And so it's not, yeah, I agree with everything that everybody said. I have absolutely no disagreements. And yet, as a committed follower of the great philosopher Antonio Gramsci, you know, his most famous slogan is this idea that we should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, meaning to have an understanding of the world that sees through the comforting illusions of our time, and what we face to build a better world, but always also which keeps our attention focused on the possibilities for making a difference, guided by that hard-headed analysis. So in other words, I spend my whole life training organizers. That's what I do for a living, and doing my own activism around the climate crisis. And so therefore, for me, the questions are, what are we facing and what do we do about it? And I really agree with what Doug said at the very beginning about, in terms of US politics, that we're sort of between manic reaction and a torpid center that is not holding. And I really do think we're in a place where that center cannot hold, right? And so, and I actually think that that we are entering a revolutionary period, for good or for bad, right? Like, in other words, revolutionary periods are periods where everything comes unglued and you don't know what's going to happen. So what I mostly saw in 2021 was a deepening of the processes of instability that I think are leading us, for good or bad, into a truly revolutionary period in human history. Given the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, the crisis in global inequality, concentration of wealth, we're in a time of deep global transformation. The world in 10 years cannot and will not be very much like the world we're in now, either because we're able to make the changes needed to make human society possible, or we won't, and we're going to deal with the terrible consequences. And of course, most likely it's going to be a mixture of both of those things. And so my comments aren't an opinion on whether we're screwed or not. They're more of an attempt to help us understand the crises we face and the nature of our work in facing those crises. And yes, I do think it's important to keep in our vision that utopian future on the other side of these crises. I've been very influenced by the Zapatistas and that slogan that says another world is possible. And I think it's crucial that we keep that other world in our frame as we face the crises. And I do think that that the climate crisis kind of forces some of the things that maybe lead towards the possibilities of better outcomes. So as I argue in my book, The Sea is Rising and So Are We, which is a handbook for climate activists, the scientists and the engineers have already done their part. We know the nature of the problems. We know what needs to be done. Sustainable technologies still need more investment and development, but the fact is that we have all the technologies we need for everyone on the planet to live lives of pleasure, comfort, and abundance within the biophysical limits of the planet. And interestingly, the things we need to do to address the climate crisis are almost all the same things we need to do to make the world less dominated by capitalist logics. That presents huge opportunities for the left to build the world we've been dreaming of in the process of addressing the climate crisis, which is, I think, one of the reasons why actually in the US and its political system right now, the right wing has kind of taken some of the kind of populism of the left into their agenda, and the Democrats, mainstream Democrats, really have no ideas for how to get us through these crises, and so are increasingly kind of drawing on the ideas of the left. And so I think we should not underestimate the ideological and also kind of political opportunity that this moment gives to us. And I know you're all going to think I'm crazy when I say this, but I still am going to say this, that the climate crisis actually requires that the world moves quickly to realizing some of the goals of anti-capitalists and people on the left. We actually need to move to 20-hour work weeks for most people. Indigenous lifestyles need to be encouraged, and Indigenous people need to be made the stewards of much of the world's undeveloped land. We need to deeply shift agriculture in favor of small-scale sustainable agriculture. We need to drastically and immediately lower the levels of inequality in the world. We need to invest in the care economy, and we need to have social policies that are driven by human needs and not by profit. What's keeping us from getting to the world of abundance that I just that we all know what that would look like are politics and economics of racialized capitalism. That doesn't mean that we need to overthrow capitalism first in order to get to a sustainable world. We don't have time for that. But it does mean that we need to look at the ways that capitalism has gotten us into the crisis. And for those on the left, it's our task to use that understanding to address the parts of the transition that we need to make and are in fact in the process, maybe too slowly, but we are in the process of making that transition that other folks aren't working enough on. Some examples of the specific contributions that anti-capitalists can make in addressing the climate crisis are One, the need to challenge pro-capitalist economic thinking, because of course, part of what's slowing the transition to a just and sustainable world are the ideas of growth, that growth is good, that regulation and the radical redistribution of wealth are bad for the economy. So we need to completely set aside that whole way of thinking about economics. Fortunately, there are an incredible number of economists in the world right now doing that really important work of thinking of it differently. So then we need to do the ideological work of getting people weaned off of pro-capitalist economic thinking. We, of course, need to fight for high levels of taxation, and that needs to be one of our most urgent tasks, because inequality is a large driver of status-driven anxiety and consumerism. Inequality, of course, just leads to precarity and impoverishment for people all over the world. It also leads to outsized political power of the rich. The money that comes from taxing the rich can be used to fund public goods, and public goods are crucial for the new world that we're building and for getting to a sustainable world. Anti-capitalists know how to look at the relationships of power and ways that operations of power get in the way of unhealthy and humane solutions. We know that taking the political power from the fossil fuel and agribusiness companies needs to be also at the top of our agenda. That's most of what the political work I do nowadays is around stigmatizing the fossil fuel and agribusiness industries. They are the single most powerful forces slowing our transition. Other people working in taping climate action can focus on developing new technologies and pushing for the win-win solutions where business and environment can both be better off with non-controversial or less controversial policy changes. But we're the ones who need to face down and expose and challenge the power holders who are actively slowing the transition to a survivable world. I want to now take just a couple minutes to talk about some of the dangers and opportunities of the moment. I also kind of focus more on the US, and even though we're a panel of the Center for Global Justice in Mexico, this really is a North American panel. Of course, we all know that the forces, as Jeff actually mentioned, the forces of white supremacy are under a demographic threat, and part of the extreme polarization of the moment is that there are many white people who feel that their hegemonic centrality is slipping away, and it makes them vulnerable to racist demagogy. We also know that that's true in every white dominant society in the world. As the climate crisis leads much of the global south to become unlivable, and the ways that capital circulates and the nature of our rapacious global institutions means that we will continue to have migration from the global south to the global north. And while there's nothing wrong with that, and actually as the industrialized countries have shrinking birth rates, it's actually a good thing to get more migration from the south to the north. Of course, that also leads to sort of more kind of panic among white supremacist folks. Number three, we live in a time of epistemological crisis where the kinds of things that in the past have drawn people into a shared understanding of our shared world are crumbling. That leads to possibilities of all kinds of political fluidity that we're seeing around the world right now. That opens up possibilities on the left, as we're no longer living in a world mediated by systems of knowledge controlled by elites to the extent that we did before. But given how much of our understanding of the world is shaped by social media, which is run by profit-driven model of tapping into our most vulnerable and unstable parts of ourselves, the possibilities for global movements like the one that led to January 6th are of course increasing. So our organizing is taking place in an incredibly unstable landscape of ideas. Number four, the forces that control capital are increasingly unaccountable to any forms of control. And as Yanis Varoufakis has been arguing, the world is increasingly dominated by a zombie form of finance capital, which is addicted to profits, yet decreasingly able to find ways to engage in productive activity, and so finds ways to park its capital in places like housing, which then exacerbates the housing crisis and leads to the housing bubble that Doug mentioned earlier. Finally, and most importantly, to keep the world livable for our species, we must cut global emissions in half by 2030 and to zero by 2050. And so now to a couple of more positive elements of the chaotic moment that we're facing. The climate crisis and the COVID crisis make the neoliberal consensus no longer possible. Even dominant actors in the world know that we need regulation, targeted investments to address the climate crisis. The COVID crisis, of course, calls out for public health solutions. We are in a period of increased attention to the importance of public goods. And so that's a big ideological opening for us to organize our way into. I also think, number two, that the left is clearer in its analysis than at any time in the past 150 years. For young people just coming into political consciousness, it's actually easy for them to see that we are fighting against the interrelated practices of dehumanizing forms of domination. Many people who are radicalized to our side right now are shockingly able to see the interconnected nature of capitalism, racism, gender-based discrimination, and other forms of dehumanization. And that kind of core set of dehumanization at the kind of I would say the core of the kind of 500-year trajectory we've been on with capitalism and with racial capitalism. Number three, we no longer need to choose between reform and revolution, as more people are understanding anti-capitalism as not a kind of something that leads us to a far off and mythical revolution, but rather as a slow marching process through the institutions and a path to a better world that lots of us and many of the kind of emerging solidarity economists kind of see a step-by-step pathway towards. Number four, we no longer need to choose between a politics that believes in the state and plays its game happily pretending that that it's sort of, you know, just and fair and easy, or a politics that pretends that we can ignore the state. We understand that we need both, and a kind of a dynamic and synergistic relationship between those two forms of politics. Number five, I've already mentioned this, but economists working in solidarity economics, feminist economics, and the new economy paradigms have all developed powerful tools for understanding how to run our societies in ways that lead to that can lead to there being enough for everyone and for the planet. And finally, that information on new models and new forms of organizing are spreading at speeds like we've never seen before. So in conclusion, because we are living in revolutionary times, and so it is an incredible time to be involved in social change work. We have a world historic set of tasks ahead of us. Anybody can play a role in addressing those tasks. I would say to anybody listening to this, if you're not already engaged in social change work, this is a great time to get involved for your own mental health, as well as because there are many possibilities and options to be involved. I have to say that folks I know who are involved in climate change work find it incredibly therapeutic, as opposed to sitting back and saying, oh my God, it's happening and nobody's doing anything. No matter where you are, there are institutions you can push to decarbonize. No matter where you live, there are laws you can push for or against to move social policy in the direction of sustainability. There are electoral contests to be involved with. There are organized, if you live like I do in a blue place, there are plenty of organizations like Working America that are pushing people to be engaged electorally in other areas. There are lifestyle changes you can make and spread among your community, though that's not particularly the biggest significance. And there are thousands of organizations working on these things. You can join them. And if you find it difficult to think about that, please don't hesitate to email me for advice on how to get involved. And you can find me on the internet and find my email. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you all. Now, we only have about 20 minutes left, but I do want to give the members of the panel an opportunity to react to one another, raise questions. So who wants to go first among our panelists? Okay, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, there's just too much to there's too much to react to. I think Cynthia's right. We're roughly all on the same page. And the question for me is, all right, you know, how do you imagine, what do we imagine the path is? Not how can we describe a better society, but given what everyone has said about the situation and what we've been living through, it's, I think one important question is, okay, here we are, January 2022, we've got this right-wing fascist threat, and I think, from my view, if we're not able to deal with that, nothing will follow. So as I say, I think it's really important to figure out, or to not figure out, but I'm for a popular front for a while, in order to, as I said in the 30s, in order to deal with this fascist threat. I just like to, one other point, I know we don't have much time, but I think that Cynthia's right about public goods, the public sector. The problem is that public trust in the public sector has it diminished tremendously. When Lyndon Johnson started the Great Society, it was something like 75 to 80% of people in the Gallup poll said they trusted the government to do right most of the time. Before Trump even became president, it was down to 17%. So restoring the faith in the public sector, which is critical. And that means, I think, to be even more radical in issues of transition. Most Americans understand that we have a global crisis. But when you say to many in the working class, well, we're going to do all this, and yeah, you may lose your job in the steel mill and the coal mine, and the restaurant that serves people around these industries.
Jeff, you went on mute. I can see your mic is muted.
Into a muted mic.
There
Yeah.
you are. You're
Okay,
We're
now.
back.
Jesus, why didn't somebody say something?
I said it as soon as I saw it.
It just happened. That's okay.
Okay, at any rate, I was trying to follow up on the issue of the public sector, which is critical. Most Americans understand that we have a global crisis. They understand about global warming. And if you say to them, we've got to do something about it, yes. But if you say to me, what you have to do is put your job on the line. And don't worry, because the economists tell us that there'll be plenty of green jobs for everybody. That replicates the experience we had with trade. Free trade. Oh, don't worry, free trade is going to be okay. You might lose your job, but we can get some retraining and we can. No, that's not going to work.
Right.
In this kind of society, people are afraid of change. I mean, our friends and people in our tribe are not afraid of change. We live on change. We think about change, but most people, are essentially conservative. So the question is, do we have a way of saying, yeah, you may lose your job on Friday, but we're going to make sure on Monday you can go to work. Not you may lose you. And I tell you, the environmental community doesn't seem to care about this at all. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, but I think that that's one of the real virtues of the Green New Deal, right? Is that it talks seriously about just transition. And there's I'm in California, and the Political Economy Research Institute, Robert Pollin's thing out of UMass Amherst, did a really good analysis of the just transition for California, right? So this is no longer hypothetical or abstract. And that's why I say things are moving incredibly quickly. There are really good, very concrete, specific plans for a politics of just transition, and we need to advocate for them. And in terms of the sort of lack of public support for public goods, that's Democratic Socialists of America and the Progressive Democrats are just doing a great job with that. And if you look at the polling on kind of all of Bernie's positions, there's incredible popular support for all of that, right? And so I just think it's like, short term, it's about staying the course, about actually engaging in the next elections to get more and more progressive Democrats elected.
Doug, you want to react to any of this?
Well, I want to make two comments. One is, I think we're seeing in this current inflation problem we've got now, whatever the causes of it, at least one part is there's been a restriction on fossil fuel production. And a lot of big oil under pressure from Wall Street, which is discovering its green streak to some degree, has been reluctant to finance fracking. Private equity guys are trying to move in, but there is a reluctance to finance carbon at this point. Not enough, but then this also brings up the problem of transition. It's making gasoline prices very expensive. It's raising the prices of energy. And that kind of green transition is going to have a lot of, we can do all we can to soften it, but there will be a lot of transitional shocks. And this is one of them that will be very, very difficult to manage politically. And the inability of Biden and the Democrats to handle this inflation challenge, I think, is suggestive of the larger problem that awaits us if we're really going to have any kind of serious energy transition. The other thing I'd like to do is ask Jeff, who's spent a lot of time in Washington and spent a lot of time around Democrats, why are they so terrible? Like, why are they so much better at suppressing the left wing of their party and the challenge of the Sanders campaign than they are challenging the Republicans, who are a threat to human life? Is it just their paymasters? Is it the lack of energy? What is it?
They feed from the same. I think there's two things. They're paymasters and the media. They're very, very sensitive to any all of these criticisms from the right, because they think those criticisms have more push and more bite than criticisms from the left. But I do think it's a culture. It's a culture that is, these people got to where they are by pursuing a certain kind of strategy for their lives. And, one of those strategies is to understand that money counts for almost everything in their politics. And it's not just campaign finance. It's knowing that there are powerful people there to take care of you after you lose your election or after you quit. So
we need to draw on that if they lose some elections.
Yeah, it's a capitalist culture, not just a capitalist economy, but it's a capitalist culture in their head. At the same time, they're torn because they've got to get votes of more than just the capitalists, and so you get this ambivalence, you get this double-facedness, you get this treachery, like the Clintons and Obama and Biden before he became president. So it's a very, very powerful culture, and that's at least that's my take after my years. I don't think there's.
Well, those are my suspicions from 250 miles away. So I'm glad.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, can I jump in on this?
Yes, Peter.
I think the Democrats are much better when it comes to domestic policy, as backboneless as they seem to be, than they are when it comes to foreign policy.
Probably right.
And so I'm going to ask Doug's question to Jeff also. Why are they so much worse on foreign policy than they should be? Even the progressives tend to not be very good on some of these issues. Some of the ones you were raising about Latin America, the progressives are not very good on.
No, they're. I mean, here we have this migration crisis from Central America, and our foreign policy is all aimed at the Ukraine, at Taiwan. What about 150 years of subsidizing these criminals who've been running these Central American countries, right? And overthrowing anybody, like in Honduras and in Guatemala and other places, anybody who tries to challenge them. So at any rate, but to get to your point about why they do this, what comes in mind is a conversation I had with with an ex-senator. We had both just published books and we were at a book signing thing. And I said to him, you know, we started talking about military spending, and he was on the Armed Services Committee. And I said, Jesus, you know, why is it, the same question you raised, why is it so hard? I mean, you know, nobody wants war. Everybody knows that the Pentagon budget is just full of corruption and fat and greed. And he said to me, he said, Jeff, these people are all over this town. All over this town. He said, no matter where you go, they're there.
And they do the Pentagon programs in a very smart way. And they put them in every district and every state.
It's never been audited. We've got
They can't even audit
$1
it.
trillion out there, never been audited. They can't audit it.
Right, they can't.
Well, now, to be fair, the Democrats did drop 2 atomic bombs. They founded the CIA and NATO. They really started the Cold War. You know, Bob Dole was not completely wrong when he said all the wars of this 20th century have been Democrat wars. So they have a long history of this sort of thing.
But you go back to 44 at that Democratic convention, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll asking people who they wanted the ticket as vice president. 65% said they wanted Henry Wallace as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. And, you know, we would have had a very different world had Wallace become president on April 12th, 45, instead of Truman. So we've come close a lot of times to doing better things and having different outcomes. But the Democratic Party has been post-Roosevelt. We've only had a few moments when they've been really progressive.
They dropped the bomb. They dropped the bomb in Alamogordo in 1945. A huge amazement to them.
So I want to ask you about the price controls, because, you know, when you know, part of the inflation has to do with the price of gas going up, but I think there are people who say that that wasn't sort of driven by kind of basic market forces. It was actually driven by politics. And so some people are saying that part of the transition needs to be actually being a little more aggressive about things like, you know, forcing price controls in certain circumstances.
It's part of the planning. It's part
They
of
should be expropriated and put out of business. I think.
Well, yeah.
But you know, again, talking about Democrats and Republicans, in the early 1970s, we had a burst of inflation, and Richard Nixon was president, and he slapped on wage controls or wage price controls. They were more worried about wages than prices, but both. And he slapped it, and not every economist, but most economists were appalled, and the editorial pages were appalled when he did that. And studies since then have shown that they worked. They stopped, they choked off the inflation expectations. Now, Jimmy Carter, when he was elected president, had a press conference in December. He was elected in 76. December 76, and Tip O'Neill, you know, they were just renewing presidential authority for different things. But when it came to price controls, Jimmy Carter grandstanded it at a press conference and said, "I'm rejecting the president's or the Congress's offer to reinstate my authority for price control. I believe in the free market." His chief domestic advisor, 4 years later, when the Congressional Library of Congress did interviews with people who were leaving the government, his chief congressional, Stuart Eisenstadt, his chief domestic advisor, said the worst thing we did was not accept authority for wage price controls. That destroyed Carter. It was inflation that destroyed Carter, and it gave us Ronald Reagan. And things have not been great since. Although, as a friend of mine said during the Trump years, Where's Ronald Reagan when we need him?
Even George Bush is looking good to some people.
Yeah.
Hey, Dick Cheney's looking good last week.
Dick Cheney. That's unbelievable. Yeah.
Let me put a question mainly to Peter about NATO. Why is it that the US seems so hell-bent to expand NATO and threaten Russia more and more with that?
I'm actually slightly encouraged by Biden's response on this. He is not going to be able to say publicly or give any official assurance to Russia that NATO is not going to expand, that they're not going to extend NATO membership to Ukraine or Georgia. But I think that he's at least hearing Russia's concerns for the first time. And Russia has really not given the kind of resistance for the past 30 years, or I could say since 1998 at least, to actual NATO expansion that I was expecting. So, you know what, they need Montenegro? They need what? They need Sweden now in NATO? I don't think so. They certainly don't need Ukraine. They've said that Ukraine is not going to be on the agenda for another 10 years. So I don't think that NATO expansion itself, future expansion, is so much the issue now. I think it's, he's saying he doesn't want NATO, any more NATO bases or weapons in surrounding countries, but they're going to possibly come to a deal on renewing the INF treaty, which would be something easily achievable. That would be a good thing. I think we're not going to see any increased NATO encirclement, and that would be a good thing. So the question is, are somewhat private assurances going to satisfy Putin right now? And I'm hoping that they will, because the consequences for if Russia did go in, I mean, he's got other options. He can recognize the breakaway republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. That would not require military invasion or incursion to do that. There are other things that Russia could do, but I think that there's a basis now for going back to the Minsk II agreements. You know, France and Germany negotiated that along with Ukraine and Russia, and Zelensky has not shown any willingness to do that. He's rejected it, but I think they're going to put a lot of pressure on him now to restart negotiations on that. So I'm slightly optimistic. Although what I learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis is the exact same thing that Kennedy and Khrushchev both learned, that they lost control. That one of these crises develops, you quickly lose control. And Khrushchev sent that remarkable letter to Kennedy after the crisis. And he said, "From evil, some good must come. Both of our countries, our people have felt the flames of thermonuclear war." He said, what we need to do now is eliminate every conflict between us that could possibly cause another crisis. And they began to do that. And had Kennedy not been assassinated and Khrushchev toppled, maybe they would have succeeded in 63 or 64. So I think that's the lesson that we've got to learn. We've got to eliminate these conflicts. And there are, you know, a lot of hawks. These CNASers are very hawkish, and they believe in American exceptionalism, and they believe in unipolarity, and in a world that's moved beyond that. So I'm very worried, but I'm not totally pessimistic.
Peter, when you say that you think that there's, as I understood you, that there's not going to be efforts to continue to encircle Russia, is that just Biden, or is that a change in the foreign policy establishment so that you know, it's something that it's accepted, you think, some way?
Yeah, I think they're split still, Jeff. When I listen to what Stoltenberg says, or even listen to what Blinken says and Sullivan says, I'm not very encouraged. But I think of and the fact that it's Wendy Sherman doing negotiating instead of Victoria Nuland, or Sullivan or Blinken, I think is a good sign right now. How deep it goes, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, those people are, they're so deeply embedded throughout Washington, which is why I think we need to get to the progressive Democrats, Jamie and other people who have a better understanding of this and some historical context for understanding this. Because I think a lot of what Putin's saying is understandable and justifiable. And I think a lot of what the Chinese are saying is also understandable and justifiable. Not that I like what they're doing domestically in either situation, but I think in the world right now, the era of American unipolarity is over, and we have to figure out how we make transition peacefully. And that's a big challenge we have on a global scale right now.
I would just like to add that I think that one of the keys to this is to connect the empire and its costs to the future of the domestic economy and our society. That is, you can't have both anymore. You can't develop all the things we need to redevelop in this country and continue supporting this empire. And I think it's not just about money, it's also about attitude, and it's about the way you think about America and the world.
I've got to say goodbye because I've got to be on in 3 minutes, my first of 3 Russian or Russian and other.
Hello to everybody in Moscow for us.
Good luck with that.
Well, thank you for joining.
Thank you. It's
us,
great seeing
Peter.
everybody.
And I know that Doug has to leave shortly also. So we will need to wrap this up.
Thank you.
But there is, I saw one hand from Bob Stone. So let's take one question from him and if possible, Joyce Carlson. And if any of our panelists need to leave, you would be excused with our thanks. But Bob, unmute yourself.
I'd like to, I'm sorry to miss Peter, but I want to direct to Jeff a question that would mobilize politically some of Peter's urgent life-saving or planet-saving advice by activating the left of the Democratic Party. It seems to me we've been through a 20-year war that has cost lives and money. And for what? For so far as I can tell, it's for the greater glory of the military industrial congressional media complex. And that this government, this regime that is ready to give over the future to that complex is very vulnerable. And I think they are ready to hear the anti-capitalist message that Cynthia is proposing. That's to say, apparently, here's where Peter would be needed. Apparently, these aircraft carriers that are supposed to make all the difference in the confrontation with China in the South China Sea just don't make sense militarily. They're extremely vulnerable. Why then would you parade those out front as if it were World War II redux? They would be taken out immediately by Chinese missiles. Point is, they're very expensive, and once you get the money into the pockets of the military industrial complex, who cares who wins or loses the war? These are people who are ready to push us out front as a nation of hostages on the what is it called, the Stockholm model. We are being made to identify with our hostage takers, the military industrial complex, that has to be broken, that fascinated deference to this so-called defense that we're getting from. It's not defense, it's about money. And I think the lesson of the Afghan war is it was about money, and that's the place where there are people out there ready to hear that message now. What do you think of that, Jeff? You have some of the sense of what's politically possible.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt in the minds of a whole lot of people who are not on the left that it's about money. Some of them are getting profits from this. Some of them are getting jobs from this because, as what I think Doug said before, they spread the military budget around. And it's so I don't know the answer to your question, but let me just make one point, pick up one point. You asked, so who cares if we lose these wars? That's a good question. The answer is nobody cares. Ever since Nixon disposed of the draft and ended the draft, we have been fighting with a mercenary army. It's expensive, it's bloated, it's greedy, and it's probably inefficient despite all its technological toys. But there's been a severance between America's commitments to war and its operations overseas and the lives of Americans. And I think that's the place that needs to be put back together.
Yeah. I hear you. I agree. Thank you.
Okay, Joyce Carlson had a brief comment, I think.
Oh, shoot. Am I muted?
No, we
No.
hear you.
I wanted to show Peter this. You can't see it very well. It's a switch I bought at a garage sale here in town. I'm from Los Alamos, and it's a switch from a garage sale that Joseph McKibben's family had, and he's the guy that flicked the first switch on the bomb in Alamogordo. A really nice guy. I
Does
think,
it still work? Watch it. Does it
yeah. It's just a tacky way to get your attention. And here's another tacky way. This is a nose cone from a nuclear weapon. I think it's a B-61, I don't know. My husband worked at decommissioning 32,000 nuclear weapons in his career. He got from 32,000 in 74, and now we're at 4,000. But now the local newspaper put out this article. We built a new B-61 bomb, which is safer, believe it or not. Read about it. It's incredible how safe they are. But it represents a compromise of what we're doing, a compromise between conservative values of protecting your country and liberal values. I don't know, but it's a good step forward, I think. And I want you to read the comments I put in the chat. You too, Jeff. I met you one night at Betsy's. What a wonderful visit we had, but I've learned so much. Lately, I've been reading E.O. Wilson on human nature and some of his other work and his obituary in the New York Times. He was an evolutionary psychologist, and that science of evolutionary psychology has learned so much about human nature. And if you guys would study human nature, that would explain so much. I would start, as I keep telling you, with Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, or Steven Pinker, The Enlightenment Now. It's not capitalism, it's human nature. And I wish you'd work on figuring out compromises instead, moral politics. Please, thank you.
Okay,
On that note, Cliff, I've got to sign off.
right. Our other panelists have had to also, but I
Okay.
want to thank you as I thank them for their presentations and for a very stimulating discussion.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Take care.
Hopefully in San Miguel next year.
San Miguel or
Yeah, please, come on back.
or Mr. Zoom.
We've got a large audience here waiting for your return.
See you later. Thank you. Thank you. See you all later.
Okay.
Adios.
Let me now end by reminding you that this webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Next Monday, we will shift gears and look at the rural US. Talk by Joe Belden, who's an expert in rural affairs. And he asks the questions, should city folks and progressives care about the rural US? Well, when you look at how much of Trump's support, how strong Trump's support is in the rural part of the US, we probably should care. But tune us in next Monday to hear Joe Belden talk about that. And now let me close by thanking our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Olivia Cannell, Betsy Bowman, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.